The story opens with a sudden, gut-wrenching scene where Nadia and her mother are dragged from their small ship by slaver guards, their hands bound. As the harsh metallic door of the slaver's ship slams shut, the screams of other captives echo in the distance. Nadia's eyes narrow in defiance as a tall, imposing alien named Grather Drek looks down at her, smirking. "Another weak human," he sneers, mocking her with exaggerated pity. "Maybe you'll be useful for something." But as Nadia meets his gaze, a flicker of recognition flashes in her eyes, and she speaks, her voice steady but loud enough for all to hear. "My mother's name is Captain Miranda Cole." The entire room falls silent. Grather's smirk falters, and a shiver runs through the slavers. Nadia's mother, a feared and respected figure, had a reputation among the galaxy's most dangerous factions. That name is a reminder of a past that even the toughest slavers would rather forget. Nadia Cole didn't cry. Not when the ship's engine screamed to life, sending them into the cold, unforgiving void of space. Not when the doors of their small vessel were blasted open by the slavers' raiding party. She didn't even flinch when the claws of the Zorian guards sank into her skin, hauling her out of the cockpit like a sack of grain. She had been through too much to shed tears for herself. But her mother, Captain Miranda Cole, didn't make a sound either, her face as still and stoic as stone. She had taught Nadia that the world didn't care about your pain. If you showed weakness, they would exploit it. So, Nadia clamped her lips shut, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. There would be time for fear later, but not now. Not when survival was the only thing that mattered. The slavers' base on Karzal was little more than a shattered, decaying moon, a desolate rock orbiting a dying star. The surface was jagged and cracked, blackened from centuries of neglect. A single, imposing facility stood at its center, its windows smeared with the grease and grime of countless transactions. Inside, a pit of despair and greed churned, where beings from every corner of the galaxy came to buy and sell lives. The Zorians, large reptilian creatures, threw them into a grim holding pen with little ceremony. Nadia barely registered the clanging sound of the door as it slammed shut behind them. The room smelled of sweat, fear, and the acrid scent of metal. The walls were lined with other captives, their eyes hollow, their bodies gaunt from malnutrition and mistreatment. Nadia spotted a few humans among the other prisoners. Their eyes met hers, and they gave her nothing more than a quick, fearful glance before looking away, as if acknowledging her presence would be an invitation for the slavers to take notice. She understood that unspoken rule all too well. These people weren't just prisoners. They were marked for death or worse. If she made a sound, if she let a single emotion slip, they would drag her out of the pen and subject her to whatever horrors they had planned. She turned to her mother, who stood beside her, her arms folded, her back straight. Miranda's sharp eyes surveyed the room, cataloging every face, every movement, searching for weakness. "Stay calm, Nadia," she whispered, her voice low, barely audible above the noise of the prison. "We'll find a way out." Nadia nodded, but inside, her mind raced. They had been captured during a raid on the Outer Rim, a routine mission gone wrong. They'd been far from the Federation's reach, deep in enemy territory. Her mother's old connections, the ones she'd worked so hard to sever, had led them here. Nadia's pulse quickened. They were on Karzal now, the most notorious slave market in the galaxy, and all they had was each other. A harsh laugh cut through her thoughts, followed by the unmistakable click of boots on concrete. Nadia's heart skipped a beat. Grather Drek, the slaver lord, approached. He was massive, almost 7 feet tall, with a scaled face twisted into a permanent sneer. His eyes were small and dark, barely visible beneath a heavy brow. He was flanked by 2 of his soldiers, both Zorians, their sharp claws clicking with each step. "So, these are the famous Cole women," Grather said, his voice dripping with mockery. His smile was too wide, his teeth gleaming unnaturally white against his grayish skin. He eyed Nadia first, then her mother, sizing them up like animals in a pen. Miranda said nothing, but Nadia felt the weight of her mother's silence. She had always been a woman of few words, but when she spoke, it was with a purpose, and it carried weight. Nadia could only wonder how long it would take for them to break her. The slavers didn't just take people, they shattered them first. Grathur's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a predatory grin. He reached out, gripping Nadia by the chin, forcing her face upward to meet his gaze. I'd hoped for something more interesting. But I suppose you'll do. His breath reeked of something vile, making Nadia's stomach churn. He tilted her head, inspecting her like some rare specimen. Nadia fought the urge to flinch. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction. What's your name, little girl? Grathur asked, his voice sickly sweet. And what can we expect from you? Will you make us money, or are you just going to break and beg for mercy? Nadia's jaw clenched. I'm Nadia Cole, she said flatly. Her voice was steady, defiant. Grathur's amusement seemed to deepen. Cole? The name sounds familiar. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Captain Miranda Cole, perhaps? Nadia didn't respond. Her mother's identity was not something she would speak of lightly. If the slavers knew who her mother was, they would treat them both with even more cruelty. But Grathur's eyes lit up at the mention of Miranda's name. Oh, yes, Grathur mused, his grin widening. Now I remember. The legendary Captain Miranda Cole, the one who led that little rebellion against the slavers a few years back. A shame she died, though. A real shame. He chuckled darkly, releasing Nadia's chin. Nadia's heart pounded. Her mother hadn't been dead. But how much of her past had survived in whispers and rumors? And how much of it had been twisted? Grathur stepped back, eyeing both of them with renewed interest. I wonder, will you be as strong as they say? Or will you crumble, just like the others? The slavers laughed, and Nadia could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she refused to break under the pressure. Her mother had always told her that nothing in this universe was stronger than the human spirit. It was a lie the slavers were too stubborn to understand. We'll see, Nadia said, her voice quieter now, but every word carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. Grathur paused, the smirk fading from his face. There was something in Nadia's eyes that made him hesitate. He looked to his soldiers, who exchanged confused glances. Nadia could feel the shift in the air, the tension building. The slavers thought they had them cornered. They thought they had already won. But they had no idea what they were dealing with. The door to the holding pen slammed shut behind them, locking them in the cage of despair. Nadia's pulse thrummed in her ears, and for the first time, she allowed herself a single, deep breath. Whatever came next, she was ready. The sound of footsteps echoed through the holding pen, each heavy thud of boots a constant reminder of their helplessness. Nadia sat against the cold stone wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching her mother. Miranda had barely moved since they were thrown into the cell hours ago. Her posture was rigid, her eyes scanning the room as though plotting their escape, but she said nothing. Her silence was her shield, and Nadia knew better than to ask questions. They had learned a lot in those few hours. The slavers were brutal, yes, but they were also predictably arrogant. Grathur Drek had been amused by Nadia's declaration of her mother's name, but the curiosity in his eyes hadn't faded. He had retreated with his soldiers shortly after, leaving behind a silence that pressed against Nadia's chest. But that silence didn't last long. The first slaver to approach their pen was a tall, wiry Zorian with jagged scales and a permanent sneer. He eyed them both as if they were little more than a nuisance, his reptilian eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, but his hands, long and tipped with sharp claws, rattled the cage in front of them. His presence was a reminder that the slavers hadn't forgotten about them. Food, he muttered, shoving a tray of stale bread and water through the bars, his voice a harsh rasp. His eyes flicked toward Miranda and then to Nadia. Eat. Nadia didn't take the food immediately, but her mother did. Miranda's fingers didn't tremble as she reached for the bread. She tore off a piece, chewing it slowly, but there was no gratitude in her actions, only cold efficiency. They were calculating their next move, Nadia knew that much. The Zorian stood by the pen, watching them, waiting for some sign of weakness. Nadia could feel his eyes on her, the tension between them thick enough to slice through. She refused to look at him directly, her gaze locked on the floor, but she could feel the intensity of his stare. Hours passed. The pen grew colder as the sun dipped behind Karzal's jagged horizon. Nadia didn't know how long they had been locked in this miserable cage, but every minute stretched longer than the last. Then, a voice broke the stillness. "You shouldn't have said her name." The voice came from behind them. Nadia's heart lurched as she recognized the voice, low, gravelly, and dripping with contempt. It was Grather Drek. He stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his soldiers. His eyes glinted with a dangerous curiosity. He was no longer the smug, mocking figure from earlier. There was something more in his gaze now, something far more calculating. "You think you can intimidate me by mentioning that ghost of a woman?" Grather continued, stepping forward into the dim light of the pen. "Cole isn't a threat anymore. She's dead, girl. The people who feared her? Gone. And now you're nothing more than a little human in a cage like all the rest." Nadia's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to shout that her mother wasn't dead, that they didn't know the truth, but she held her tongue. She wasn't ready to let Grather see how his words rattled her. Instead, she stared at the floor, her mind racing. What was he doing here? Why now? "Maybe," Grather said, his smile widening, "I'll make an example out of you too. Show the galaxy that the Cole name means nothing anymore. A broken legend. A discarded memory." He turned to his soldiers, who chuckled, clearly relishing the idea. He took a step toward the bars, his eyes never leaving Miranda. "You were a thorn in the side of the slavers, Cole," he sneered. "But all that did was make you a target. And now you and your daughter will pay the price for the trouble you caused. Think of it as poetic justice." Miranda's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She never did when the slavers tried to provoke her. Nadia's heart raced in her chest as she looked up at her mother, searching for any sign of fear, but there was none. Miranda's expression was unreadable, her posture as rigid and resolute as ever. Grather leaned in closer, his breath rancid. "So tell me, little girl," he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost coaxing. "How much does that name of yours matter now? How many will come running when they hear the great Captain Cole's daughter is in a cage?" He grinned, showing his sharp teeth. "I think none." Nadia's pulse quickened. Grather was taunting them, trying to break their resolve. The slavers knew they could break anyone with enough time and pressure. They thought her mother was powerless. They thought she was just another fading relic of a broken past. And they were wrong. Nadia stood slowly, her legs stiff from the long hours of sitting. She didn't know if it was fear or defiance that propelled her forward, but she stepped toward the bars, her eyes locking with Grather's. He was too smug. Too confident. He didn't know what he was dealing with. "I'm not afraid of you," Nadia said, her voice steady. "And neither is she." Grather's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but Nadia saw it. The smallest crack in his composure. "Is that so?" "Yes," Nadia answered, her voice low but unwavering. "You think you've won. You think you've broken us, but you haven't. You have no idea what my mother is capable of. You have no idea who you're messing with." Miranda finally moved, her gaze sharp and intense. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Grather. "You think that by holding us here you've broken me?" she said, her voice cold as ice. "I've been in worse places. I've faced worse men than you." The room grew still. The slavers, who had been laughing moments ago, suddenly quieted. They could feel the shift in the air. They had underestimated her. Underestimated both of them. Grather's expression darkened. He took a step back, but his smirk remained. "We'll see how long you hold on to that defiance, Captain. Soon you'll be begging for mercy, just like every other broken soul who has walked through these doors." But Nadia didn't flinch. Her mother had taught her that words were just that, words. The slavers had power, yes, but it was fragile. Just like their arrogance. As Grather turned to leave, Nadia caught a glimpse of something new in his eyes, fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. and for the first time since they'd arrived on Karzal, Nadia felt a flicker of hope. Her mother's name wasn't just a legacy. It was a weapon. And it wasn't done fighting yet. The dim light of the holding pen flickered weakly as the hours dragged on, the air thick with the suffocating tension of anticipation. Nadia sat against the cold wall, her fingers curled into tight fists, her mind spinning with plans and possibilities. Every sound, the distant clanking of chains, the occasional low murmur of other prisoners, seemed to echo louder than it should have. But it wasn't the noise that kept her up. It was the quiet, persistent hum of fear that lurked just below the surface, threatening to break through. Her mother, however, seemed unmoved by the passage of time. Miranda remained seated, her posture rigid as she studied the movement of the guards. Her gaze never wavered, calculating each step, every sound, every subtle shift in the behavior of the slavers who passed by their cell. After what felt like an eternity, the door to the pen creaked open, and Nadia's body tensed instinctively. Grather Drek stepped through the threshold, flanked by his usual 2 soldiers. The corners of his mouth curled up in that familiar, smug grin. His presence alone seemed to suck the air from the room, as if his very existence was an affront to everything decent. Well, Grather drawled, his voice low and venomous. I've been thinking about you too. You're more trouble than I anticipated, you know that? Nadia's pulse quickened, but she didn't let the unease show on her face. Her eyes flicked to her mother, whose expression remained impassive, unreadable. Still silent, Captain? Grather sneered. I suppose you've learned nothing from all your time in the pits. It's always the quiet ones who make the biggest mess. But I can assure you, I'll break you. And that little girl of yours will be begging for mercy soon enough. Nadia refused to flinch, but her mind was racing. Grather's words were no longer empty threats. He believed them. The slavers had started to feel a shift, and they were closing in, sensing their prey slipping from their grasp. Miranda's eyes locked onto Grather with an intensity that could melt steel. You overestimate your position, Grather, she said, her voice a low, calm force. You've made the mistake of underestimating me. And you will regret it. Grather laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. Regret? Captain, you're nothing more than a dead woman walking. And your daughter, well, she's a lost cause. Nadia's throat tightened, but her mind stayed sharp. Her mother's words, though few, were deliberate and powerful. They had to act fast, before Grather could completely take control. Let's see how long you can keep that fire burning when I pull the rug out from under you. Grather continued, his gaze flicking to the cage bars, then back to them. In fact, I think it's time we get a little creative with you. He snapped his fingers, and one of the soldiers stepped forward. The slaver pressed a button on the side of the pen, releasing a faint buzz of energy as the bars shimmered with a crackling light. It's time for you both to understand where you stand in this galaxy. You're not soldiers. You're not warriors. You're just cattle, waiting to be sold. Miranda's gaze remained locked on Grather, her eyes unblinking, unwavering. You still don't understand, she murmured, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Suddenly, without warning, the air around them changed. The crackling energy around the bars dimmed, the sound of footsteps grew louder, but there was no movement from the slavers. Grather frowned. Stay alert! He barked at his soldiers, his voice tinged with a note of caution. But the sudden shift was too late. Miranda moved, quick as lightning, grabbing the nearest guard by the arm and pulling him into the bars. The Zorian soldier yelped in surprise, struggling against her iron grip, but Miranda's hold was unbreakable. Nadia's heart raced as her mother twisted the guard's arm behind his back, using his own momentum to slam him into the side of the pen. The other soldier rushed forward, but Miranda was already in motion, spinning around and delivering a powerful knee to his chest, knocking him back with a satisfying crunch. Grather stared in stunned disbelief as the 2 guards crumpled to the floor. Nadia's breath caught in her throat as she watched the precise fluidity of her mother's movements. This was the woman she had grown up with, the unshakable, unyielding force who had fought against insurmountable odds. Miranda Cole hadn't been broken. Not by Karzal. Not by the slavers. Not even by the darkest of her past. Grather's confidence faltered for the first time. You bitch! He spat, his eyes flashing with fury. But Miranda didn't give him the satisfaction of responding immediately. She turned to Nadia, her expression hard but not unkind. Get the lock, she ordered, her voice clipped. Now. Nadia hesitated for only a split second, her pulse racing. She knew what her mother meant. It was time to break free. They had the element of surprise, and the slavers would be far more dangerous if they regained their composure. With trembling hands, Nadia rushed to the lock mechanism embedded in the corner of the pen. It was a simple, crude lock, but Nadia knew she had to move fast. Her mother was holding them off, but they wouldn't have much time before more guards arrived. Her fingers fumbled with the lock for a moment, but the memory of her mother's cool efficiency grounded her. Focus. Don't hesitate. You can do this. There was a click. The lock released. Nadia yanked the bars apart, the cage door swinging open with a heavy groan. Grather's eyes widened as the realization set in. No, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. Miranda didn't waste a second. She grabbed the discarded weapon of one of the slavers, a short-barreled blaster, and took aim. Her hand was steady, her grip firm. The shot rang out, and one of the soldiers fell to the floor, unconscious. The remaining Zorian scrambled to draw his weapon, but Miranda was already moving. She dove into a roll, closing the distance in seconds, and disarmed him with a fluid strike. The weapon clattered to the floor, and with a swift kick, Miranda sent him flying into the far wall, unconscious before he hit the ground. Grather, now alone, stood frozen in fear. He was no longer the powerful slaver lord. He was just a man faced with an unstoppable force. Miranda stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his. There was no more humor, no more games in her gaze. This is over, she said simply. Nadia felt her breath catch in her throat as the last of the slavers crumpled. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her mother's fury had been unleashed, and the slavers' empire had just lost its footing. Let's go, Miranda said, turning toward the open door. And together, mother and daughter walked out of the cage, leaving Karzal and Grathus Rain behind them.